Welcome to episode 203 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we walk you through the Epicurean texts and we discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at epicureanfriends.com. We will find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. This week, we're continuing our discussion of Book 2 of Cicero's On Ends. We're beginning today in section 12. We're continuing in the Reed edition. We're on page 45 at the bottom, in the middle of Cicero's complaint that Epicurus has expanded the definition of pleasure inappropriately, and he's calling things pleasure that no one has ever called pleasure before. Last week, we went through a section where he was criticizing Epicurus's reliance on looking at animals for the conclusion as to what the highest good might be. And he has concluded section 11 by repeating his allegation that Epicurus is being inconsistent in the way he presents things, in that it makes no sense to say that the sensual stimulating pleasures are where you look, but in the end you end up with absence of pain, which is supposedly something different in Cicero's eyes than pleasure itself. So after criticizing the inconsistency of Epicurus, Cicero goes on to say this: "Now, as to Epicurus's statement that pleasure is decided by the senses themselves to be good and pain to be evil, Epicurus allows more authority to the senses than our laws grant to us when we act as judges in private suits." Cicero is going to come up with a Roman legal analogy here. Quote, "For we are unable to decide anything except that which falls within our jurisdiction. In this matter, judges often uselessly add in giving their decision the words, quote, 'if a thing falls within my jurisdiction,' unquote." And Cicero's criticizing this because if the affair was not within their jurisdiction, the decision is none the more valid for the omission of the words. Before we go further, he's raising this issue that even in courts of law, there are certain courts that have jurisdiction over certain matters and not others. And this is a concept that would have been familiar to the Romans of his time, that if you bring a matter before a judge that is not within the judge's jurisdiction, then the judge has no authority to pronounce judgment on it. We have very similar situations today in our divisions of courts of jurisdiction over different types of things. You must go to the right court in order to get a binding and valid determination of a particular question. So Cicero has launched off here by pointing out that it's very common and understandable that before we agree to the finding of a judge in a particular matter, we must find that the judge himself has the jurisdiction to issue an order on that topic. And so Cicero continues, "On what do the senses decide? On sweet and bitter, smooth and rough, nearness and distance, rest and motion, the rectangular form and the circular. Reason then will declare an unbiased opinion, aided first by the knowledge of all things human and divine, which may justly be called wisdom, then by the association of the virtues, which reason has appointed to be rulers over all things." And here's an aside. It says, reason has appointed the virtues to be the ruler of all things, but you have appointed virtue to be the attendants and the handmaidens of the pleasures. Truly, then, the opinion of all these will in the first place declare concerning pleasure that there is no chance for her. I won't say to occupy alone the throne of the supreme good, but none even for her to occupy it with morality in the way described. I'm going to stop there and we'll try to dissect that. In this section, he is stating that if you follow reason and virtue, you will never be able to allow pleasure not only to sit on the throne by herself, you'll certainly never allow pleasure to sit on the throne of judgment at all, even with virtue sitting next to her.
Okay, so he makes a series of claims about who is the arbiter in this dispute, or more properly, what is the arbiter in this dispute? And he says it cannot be the senses. They don't have the power to make this judgment. He said the same thing in section 11. He said animals have no power of judging because they don't have reason. They are restricted to the senses. He doesn't say that directly, but I think that's clearly part of his claim there.
The animals are corrupted, he was saying as well. That's another reason why they can't give a judgment. You wouldn't allow a corrupt person to be your judge.
Exactly. Now, this is somewhat difficult to parse, but one of the claims he makes, I don't know that I'm going to take them in order necessarily, but one of the claims he makes is that reason will pronounce with unbiased opinion what is good and what is not, what is the good, the telos, or the end. And I don't even think that it's true. I mean, whose reason? That's my first question. The fact that people are disagreeing about this tells me that reason is not the standard because we have so many divergent conclusions of different people possessing reason, presumably, who reach different conclusions.
Yeah, this is really a fascinating sentence that you're talking about right now, because where he says, reason then will declare an unbiased opinion, he states the two things that he thinks are the input into reason, which reason will use. He says, reason will declare an unbiased opinion, aided first by the knowledge of all things human and divine, which may justly be called wisdom, and then second, by the association of the virtues, which reason has appointed to be the ruler over all things. So he's saying that reason is going to be unbiased because it's going to bring to the judgment seat knowledge and virtue as the two things which are going to allow it to rule properly in these decisions.
Right. Now, there's a quote from Thomas Jefferson that we have discussed many times, and I'm still not entirely sure how I feel about it, Cassius, but he starts out, let me see if I can find it.
Setting reason firmly in her seat, I bet.
That's right. Yeah. Yep. There's this quote by Thomas Jefferson. He says, "Fix reason firmly in her seat and call to her tribunal every fact, every opinion. Question with boldness even the existence of a God, because if there be one, he must more approve the homage of reason than that of blindfolded fear." So Jefferson here, I mean, this is kind of a key aspect of the Enlightenment, that whole period, really, that we have been endowed with reason and that allows us to probe the secrets of everything in nature, and that it is by reason that we judge those things. And again, I'm not even sure I'm convinced that reason can be unbiased, even though it has knowledge on the one hand and virtue on the other.
Yeah, Joshua. But of course, as we know, Epicurus endorses the use of reason and says the wise man's going to be guiding his life by reason. And so it really is interesting to think about what is the different take here with Cicero looking to reason, but says reason is using knowledge of things human and divine plus virtue, while Epicurus seems to be endorsing reason as well, but says that it has apparently at its left and right sides something very different. Perhaps one way of looking at it is the senses on one side and then the young of all species on the other side. You've got the question of what is the standard of proof and where does your evidence come from? Do we really have true unbiased opinion of divine knowledge? And then where is this basis for virtue that Cicero alleges reason has appointed to be the ruler over all things? Perhaps that's the big issue right there. Why should we accept that reason has appointed virtue to be the ruler over all things? And that's where Cicero throws in his slam at Epicureans, because he says that you set virtue to be the attendant and the handmaiden of pleasure instead of pleasure to be the attendant of virtue, because Cicero doesn't want pleasure to have anything to do with virtue. And to repeat again what Cicero says, he says that truly the opinion of all these will declare that pleasure has no place at the throne of the supreme good at all. It is certainly not in the central place of making the ultimate decision, and it's not even at the side of virtue or reason. It's not even something reason will even consider in making the final determination as to what the supreme good is.
Right. Now, DeWitt dealt with this extensively in his chapter 7, The Canon, Reason, and Nature, in which he says here on page 122, this is DeWitt, "It will have been noted that the canon makes no mention of reason. This means that reason is denied rank as a criterion of truth. It will be worthwhile to observe by what procedure this exclusion may be justified." And then he goes on to say that the position of Epicurus becomes seemingly paradoxical because there is no instrumentality by which reason can be dethroned except reason itself. And we dealt with this extensively in our series on DeWitt.
Yeah, Joshua, that takes us back into that question of what is really meant by the canon of truth and whether reason is a contact with nature as a source of evidence or whether reason is sort of the weighing and analysis process. And so then you run into the question of, is it the weighing process itself that is in question, or is it the evidence and the source of the evidence that is really in question? And at least at the moment, as I'm looking at these, it seems to me that the big issue is not necessarily so much that we're using reason and a process of analysis and looking to whether things are consistent and inconsistent and analogizing them and so forth. That process of reasoning can be viewed neutrally, I think, and can be viewed agreeably by both Epicurus and by Cicero and the people who are against Epicurus. The real question, I think, comes down to, well, where is your evidence coming from? Is it from your observation of nature in the case of Epicurus, or is it in the case of Cicero and the Platonists and so forth? Is there some kind of divine and human knowledge? And is there virtue out there which you can somehow make direct contact with and consider that as your evidence?
Yeah, that's a very good place to sort of draw the line. I have a passage here from DeWitt in that chapter, and he says, I'm just going to read most of the chapter here. He says, "It will be observed that the incorporeal, eternal, and unerring reason of Plato and Aristotle is eliminated by the Epicureans. The purely human mortal reason remains. But even this is subordinated to the sensations, because," he quotes here, "not even reason can refute the sensations, for reason depends wholly upon them." This does not mean, as Gassendi imagined, that the whole content of thought is derived from the sensations, which was not the teaching of Epicurus, but rather that the deprivation of sensation is virtually death. The basic idea is the conviction that reason is incapable of making direct contact with reality. Reason is active only when the sensations are active. Without the sensations, reason possesses no criteria, since they, along with the anticipations and feelings, function as contacts with reality. Reason cannot interface directly with the stuff of nature. The word reality that he uses there has that word res as its root, R-E-S. And that is the same word that occurs in the title of Lucretius's poem, De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. So reality is sort of thingishness. That's what we define as reality here. Things that exist in nature. And reason has no capacity to directly interface with that. So how can reason sit alone on the throne? How can reason sit on the throne with virtue at her side when reason has no ability really to judge apart from the information that we get from the senses, from the prolepsis, and from the feelings of pleasure and pain?
Joshua, I'm really glad you cited what you just did when you referenced the word res in Latin and talked about things, because as we move on to the remainder of section 12 here, the very last thing in this section 12 is that Cicero is going to point out that there's a major issue between the difference between things versus names. And I think that's going to take us back to a statement in Diogenes Laertius that there's two kinds of investigation, Epicurus said, one into things versus one into words. We'll come back and look at that because I think that's a very interesting parallel between what Cicero is talking about here. But as we continue into section 12, the next thing that he says, right after he's talking about the fact that pleasure cannot occupy the throne of the supreme good, either by itself or with virtue, Cicero says, as to freedom from pain, the opinion of reason will be the same. Carneades, too, will be turned away, nor will any system concerning the supreme good be accepted which has any connection either with pleasure or absence of pain, or is disassociated from morality. I'm going to repeat that sentence. People looking into Stoicism and these other philosophies, though, we sometimes say, oh, they just have a different view of pleasure. They're happy to have pleasure. They don't care about pleasure. But this is Cicero, again, stating this central point, that the system of reason that he's referring to here will turn away from the supreme good and will not accept anything which has any connection with either pleasure or absence of pain, or which is dissociated from morality. So reason will reserve two schemes for her repeated deliberations, for she will either on the one hand decide there's nothing good which is not moral, and nothing bad which is not immoral, that all other things are either entirely without importance or have just so much that they are neither objects for our desire nor for our avoidance, but merely for our choice or our rejection. Now, this is an echo of Stoicism here in terms of indifference and preferred indifference and so forth. But continuing on, Cicero says, or she will prefer, on the other hand, that scheme which she sees not only furnished to the fullest extent with morality, but also enriched by those very primary endowments with nature, and by the perfection of life on all its sides. And she will be clearer in her judgment if she understands whether the difference between these schemes is one of things or of names. Okay, let's stop and talk about that.
Let's take up this issue of morality first. I think Cicero is on weak ground here because just because the truth ends up being immoral or amoral does not any less make it the truth. I think that has to be said. He's
Right.
using morality as part of his standard to determine what is true. But there's no universal law written into the fabric of nature that says that the outcome that turns out to be true will also be the outcome that is the most moral. I think it's ludicrous to even think in those terms.
That's the point of contention, though, because apparently the Platonists or the Stoics would think exactly that. They think that the divine fire and the prime mover and the divinity of the universe means that the moral is the true.
Yeah, and Christianity, Catholicism in particular, also holds to this idea of natural law, that nature, the world we live in, is kind of another revelation of God, and that it points us to moral truth that is absent either from the Bible or from the life of Jesus. I'm going to quote Charles Darwin later here when we get to the subject in section 13 that starts at the bottom of this page. But one of the things that drove Charles Darwin to question the existence of God, as Thomas Jefferson says in that quote, one of the things that drove Charles Darwin to question sort of providence or the idea that the universe was laid out with an orderly and moral plan was that he observed wasp mothers, I guess you could say, laying their eggs in the living flesh of other insects and then burying them underground. They're paralyzed, but they're still alive. And so the eggs hatch and the larval wasp eats its way through the living flesh of this other insect in order to give it the nutrition it needs to grow into its adult form. That when you really look at nature, you don't find morality as we would understand and expect it to be understood, that, a God who created this would have seen a different way to do that. But anyway, that's Charles Darwin's opinion. He actually ends up with the conclusion that is the directly opposite of this. By looking to nature and seeing what is in nature, he emerges with the conclusion, using his reason, vera ratio, that's a very Lucretian phrase, true reason. He emerges with the conclusion that this could not have been ordered by a moral God or a just God. And I think that argument is very persuasive.
Yeah, so Joshua, the linkage between nature and the good is where a lot of this discussion turns. Again, Cicero repeating what I think can be identified with the Stoic position, that there is nothing good which is not moral, nothing bad which is not immoral, and that everything else besides what's moral and immoral is a matter that is either entirely without importance or have just so much importance that they are neither objects for desire nor for avoidance. And so Cicero has listed that, which I think identifies with the Stoics. And then he's got the second one, which perhaps is Aristotelian. She'll prefer, on the other hand, that scheme which sees not only furnished to the full extent with morality, so he's saying this scheme has virtue in it, but also enriched by those very primary endowments of nature and by the perfection of life on all its sides. My understanding was that Aristotle sees virtue as key but not sufficient, that you also need these other primary endowments of nature, presumably such as health and sound mind, sound body, and sufficient resources to be able to live happily, that he thinks join in with virtue in the best life, neither of which are at all the same view that Epicurus has been describing. And then again, Cicero closes this section by saying, she will be clearer in her judgment if she understands whether the difference between these schemes is one of things or one of names. And again, I'd like to go back to some statements from Epicurus that may relate to that distinction between things versus names. What I was thinking of earlier, it's not in the letter to Herodotus, it's in Diogenes Laertius. But what he said to Herodotus was, first of all, Herodotus, we must grasp the ideas attached to words in order that we may be able to refer to them and so to judge the inferences of opinion or problems of investigation or reflection, so that we may neither leave everything uncertain nor go on explaining to infinity or use words devoid of meaning. So Epicurus has definitely been concerned in the letter to Herodotus about how we're using words. And then over in the biography of Epicurus and Diogenes Laertius, around line 34, where Diogenes Laertius is explaining aspects of the Epicurean canon, he says, quote, the internal sensations, they say, are two, pleasure and pain, which occur to every living creature. The one is akin to nature and the other alien. By means of these two, choice and avoidance are determined. And then here's this interesting sentence. Of investigations, some concern actual things, others mere words. It seems to me that that sentence is very close and probably talking about the same issue that Cicero is addressing when he says we need to understand the difference between these views as being one of things or of names. Diogenes Laertius says things versus words, but words seems to me to be pretty close to names. So what is the point being made here that we have to be clear about whether we're talking about things or words or names? Martin or Calathini?
Things is almost like beyond language, and almost you're experiencing things before you really start thinking about them, but yet they have an existence. So objects in the world. And then as soon as you name something, then you're taking something into the world of language, which adds a whole nother layer onto the whole experience of things.
Yeah, Calathini, I think you're talking in the right area here, that this is a reference to when you talk about names, when you talk about words. It sounds to me like this is a discussion of this logos or logic issue, of this process of assigning meaning to words and the issues that arise when you attempt to do that, and you, as you always will, fail to encapsulate every aspect of the particular things that you're describing, and you introduce the possibility of error through incorrect definitions, imprecise definitions, ambiguous definitions, overbroad definitions, and that presumably we're talking about the issues and errors that arise from the manipulation of words versus the manipulation of actual things, which of course Epicurus would say comes through the senses, I would presume, things you can touch, see, taste, feel, smell, hear. Those are actual things as opposed to the words that our minds have assigned to the actual things. I don't know that Cicero is resolving here in this sentence at the end of 12 which of the two that he's saying is the better. Maybe he'll come back to that as we go forward into 13. But he's closing this by saying that reason will be clearer in her judgment if she understands whether the difference between these schemes arises from things versus names.
He's saying that the confusion over different names for the same thing, which is one thing he's criticized Epicurus for repeatedly, that reason will give us a better answer if we give the right name to the right thing rather than multiple different names to the same thing. I might be completely off base there, but that's the best I can do. There's not much to go by here.
Yeah, I can certainly see that being part of it. That whole issue, again, of how you come up with names and words. Do they refer to actual things? Just what is the linkage between the word and the thing? How do you get from the thing itself, which exists in reality apart from our observation of it, to the assigning of a name or a word to that? The process of going from one to the other is of critical importance, and certainly not something we're going to resolve here. But Cicero seems to be pointing out, and apparently Epicurus agrees with him, as Diogenes Laertius says, that there's a difference between discussions based on actual things versus discussions based on names or words assigned to things. Okay, as we go further into 13, Cicero says, attaching myself to her opinion, I guess reason's opinion, attaching myself to reason's opinion, I shall now take the same course. So far as I can, I shall narrow the field of dispute, and shall assume that all the uncomplex schemes of the philosophers in which virtue is not added are to be entirely banished from philosophy. First, the scheme of Aristippus and all the Cyrenaics, who were not afraid to make their supreme good lie in that form of pleasure which excites the sense with the greatest possible sweetness, while they made light of your freedom of pain, Torquatus. These men did not see that just as the horse is created for speed, the ox for plowing, the dog for hunting, so man is created for two purposes, as Aristotle says, thought and action, being, so to speak, a god subject to death. And in opposition to these views, which Aristotle has just stated about how men are gods subject to death and that they're created for two purposes, thought and action, he says in opposition to those views, they, the Epicureans, have made up their minds that this godlike creature, like some sluggish and lazy beast, came into being to feed and take pleasure in propagating its kind, though I can imagine no view sillier than this. Joshua, you brought up last week, I think, this reference to men being gods subject to death. And this position that Aristotle is taking, that just as horses are created for speed, oxes for plowing, and dogs for hunting, so men are created for thought and action. That's set up there as being basically very incompatible with Epicurus.
Yeah, but just before we get to that, we see what Cicero just did there, right? He said, attaching myself to her opinion, the opinion of unbiased reason coupled with virtue, I shall now take the same course. So far as I can, I shall narrow the field of the dispute and shall assume that all the uncomplex schemes of the philosophers in which virtue is not added are to be entirely banished from philosophy. He's compressed his entire argument here into one sentence in which he just hand waves the whole issue away by saying, well, I agree with reason. Reason does not allow a place for pleasure on the throne because pleasure is immoral, or the pursuit of pleasure is immoral. And I just agree with reason. It's absurd, isn't it, that he's saying this? What he should be saying is, well, when I use my reason, this is the conclusion I get to, but you might well get to a different conclusion. This is the way that people use reason and should use reason. This is why I kind of have an issue with Thomas Jefferson in that quote, is that he's making reason out to be like a god unto itself, that reason makes the decisions. But reason is just one faculty among many. And it has pride of place in our view of ourselves because it's kind of the thing that separates us from other species of animals, right? They don't have this power to reason abstractly the way humans do. But it does not follow that just because other animals don't have reason, that reason is therefore this divine spark that guides the way and sits alone on the throne to arbitrate in a dispute between what is good and what is not. I don't think that's a valid claim. And I totally agree with what DeWitt has said there, that the Epicureans, because of their conviction that reason is incapable of making direct contact with reality, have excluded reason from the canon, from any ability really to make the kind of direct assessment of nature that is necessary to understand what is the good and what is not.
Yes, and I'm going to invite you to go forward and talk about what Aristotle says in terms of his derivation of the good from horses and speed and so forth. But before I do that, again, looking precisely at what Cicero is saying, he says he's assuming that the uncomplex schemes in which virtue is not added are to be entirely banished from philosophy. So I guess what he's saying there, to put a real precise point on the ones he's about to banish, is that if you don't at least include virtue as part of your ultimate good, then you're out of court. And of course, the ones who don't refer to virtue are going to be Aristippus, the Cyrenaics, Epicurus, and potentially Hieronymus of Rhodes as well. You've got to at least say, apparently like Carneades said, that virtue is part of the ultimate good. So he's focusing his attack first here on those who don't even include virtue at all, which is Aristippus and Epicurus and potentially others. So, as Joshua, you've just said, he just decides to wave his hand like a wand and say that we're going to follow reason. And unless virtue is part of the ultimate good, you're out of court, as if that settles the question, which it certainly does not. But then he goes on and apparently attempts to justify his reasoning by citing Aristotle here and saying, let's look to see what these creatures were made for, and we're going to see that they're not made for pleasure.
Yeah, now this is a passage I've been excited to get to here because it has so many deep implications. This is kind of the fault line that runs through all human thought and divides us into these two camps. Were we put here by an intelligence for a purpose, or were we not? Right? Now, that we came to exist without having been placed here by an intelligence does not mean that we cannot arrive at an idea of the telos, or the goal, or the purpose. DeWitt has a very good quote on that, which I'll probably get to here in a minute. But that's the main thing here that separates the two positions. And Cicero, as we could have inferred at any point in this text, is clearly falling down on the side that we were put here. There's a wonderful quote in the film Inherit the Wind, where Bert Cates, who is the teacher who is teaching evolution in this play based on the Scopes monkey trial, he says, I wanted to show these kids that we weren't just planted here like a geranium in a flower pot, that life is a long miracle. That was the quote that I remember from that film, from that play, I should say. Anyway, so that's the main disagreement. It couldn't be more clear where the Epicureans come down on this side of the argument here. And Lucretius is so good on this because he says directly, this is Lucretius, this is the 1743 edition published by Daniel Brown. But in subjects of this nature, guard yourself to the utmost of your power against that error, that gross mistake, and never believe that those bright orbs, the eyes, were made that we might see. Of that our legs were made upright, and things fixed upon them, and were supported by feet, that we might walk and take large strides, that our arms braced with strong sinews, and that our hands hung on both sides to assist us in those offices that are necessary to the support of life. And whatever constructions they put upon the other parts of the body, they are all absurd and against reason. For no member of the body was made for any particular use, but after it was made, each member found out a use proper to itself. For there was no such thing as to see before the eyes were made, nor to speak before the tongue was formed. But the tongue was rather in being before there was speech, and the ears were made long before any sound was heard. In short, all the members, in my opinion, were in being before their particular uses were set out. This is so true that to engage in battle, to mangle the limbs, and to stain the body over with blood, these were in being before any shining darts flew through the air, and nature taught us to avoid a wound before the left hand learnt to oppose a shield in our defense. I'm speaking in my own terms here now, that this stuff goes so far back in our heritage as beings that developed out of nature, out of natural processes, that this stuff is so deeply rooted in a heritage that is so ancient in us that it cannot be said that we were put here like a geranium in a flower pot, as it says in that play I mentioned, or that we were put here with a purpose, that we were put here with the goal, that we were put here like a god subject to death with two modes, thought and action. Lucretius says, all these things we may believe were invented for common benefit as they were found proper and convenient for the occasions of life. All things, therefore, that were in being before the use of them was determined, applied themselves afterwards to the office that was most suitable and serviceable to them. Of this kind principally are the senses and members of our bodies, and therefore you are to avoid upon all accounts so much as to think that they were at first formed for any particular design or use. Now, I'm glad that Lucretius starts there with the eyes, because now I'm going to read a quote by Charles Darwin. From The Origin of Species, by the way, we're recording this on November 26th. November 24th is the anniversary of the first publication of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. I think that was in 1859. And he says, to suppose that the eye with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection, seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. You'll still hear this argument. What use is half an eye? Evolution couldn't have produced something as complex as the eye because half an eye has no utility to us. This is Darwin's answer to that question before the question was even asked, really. He says, when it was first said that the sun stood still and the world turned around, the common sense of mankind declared the doctrine false. But the old saying of vox populi, vox Dei, that is, the voice of the people is the voice of God, as every philosopher knows, cannot be trusted in science. Reason tells me that if numerous gradations from a simple and imperfect eye to one complex and perfect can be shown to exist, each grade being useful to its possessor, as is certainly the case, if further the eye ever varies, and the variations be inherited, as is likewise certainly the case, and if such variations should be useful to any animal under changing conditions of life, then the difficulty of believing that a perfect and complex eye could be formed by natural selection should not be considered as subversive to our theory. So Lucretius, we have to assume here that he's transmitting the Epicurean position on this, and it totally tallies, in my view, with what Darwin would go on to discover in the middle of the 19th century, that things were not designed ahead of time and then built that way, that they developed out of nature and were put to use gradually and through iterations and variations, and that these were inherited over time and changes were made. So it's not true. It's just not true, as Cicero was saying here, that the horse is created for speed, or the ox for plowing, or the dog for fox hunting. It's not true, as Aristotle says, that man is created for two purposes, thought and action, that he is a god subject to death. So when the Epicureans come on the scene here, and in opposition to Aristotle say, this is Cicero putting his own spin on it, that man and other animals came into being to feed and to take pleasure in propagating their kind, that is a much truer description of how things actually develop, that the drive to procreate has been there since the beginning, that we were not just put here for these higher purposes of morality and virtue and reason, that nothing started with that in view. And to me, that's a fatal flaw in this whole kind of thinking. It's a fatal flaw for Aristotle, and it's a fatal flaw for Cicero. It's totally against everything we know about nature.
Joshua, let me ask you something about what you've just been discussing. The very famous passage from Lucretius about the eyes were not born in order to see and so forth is what I'd like to go back into. I can see potentially two separate points being made here. One of them, I think, is going to be absolutely clear, that Epicurus rejected the idea that a god, a supernatural being above nature, created the eye with a purpose in mind that humans use it to see. That may be a very unartful way of stating what you were just saying, but that's one of the main points, if not the main point, that there's no supernatural creation that gives rise to this use.
Yeah, not just no supernatural creation, no designer at all.
No designer, right.
No plan inherent in nature that led to the existence of the eye. It's a process inherent in nature, which is undirected and has no plan.
And so that's one of the points that I think everybody would understand from Epicurean philosophy, that Epicurus rejected the idea that men or animals or the world was created supernaturally with a plan in their minds as to what they were going to do with it, and that our goal should be to understand that plan of the supernatural creator and comply with it. There's no doubt Epicurus rejected the idea that our goal is to look to this supernatural creator and get his plan and follow it. That's clearly out of court in Epicurean philosophy. What I'd like to discuss, I wonder to what extent it would be fair to say that Epicurus is doing a little bit of the same thing by looking at what nature has created and concluding from that is a legitimate analysis to use to determine what we should do. When he looks at nature or the young of all things and see that they pursue pleasure and avoid pain, is Epicurus using a similar method of analysis as to what we've just been criticizing? And where I'm going with that is the problem that Epicurus is pointing out, not the method of analysis at looking to what has been created, but presuming that there's a designer behind it. I could see someone saying that that's what Epicurus is doing. He's looking at nature, seeing that nature tells us to pursue pleasure and avoid pain, and that the only difference between what Epicurus is doing and what Cicero and Plato are doing is that Epicurus does not endow nature as a supernatural being that has a goal. Now, that may be the entire question, and what I'm asking you makes no sense because you understood that to be the case. But do you see what I'm asking there? Because to some extent, when Aristotle says we're going to look at man and see that he's created for thought and action, I think I've heard variations of that. Aristotle is saying that man's primary natural endowment perhaps is his brain and his ability to use reason, and that therefore man is the rational animal, and our goal should be to be rational. How do you relate that kind of an argument to what Epicurus is doing when he says, I look at nature, I see nature tells us to pursue pleasure and avoid pain, and I'm following nature in doing that? Is it the same method of analysis going on, but just a different point of understanding about where it all originated?
Cassius, I'm so glad you asked that because I'm looking at Norman DeWitt's book here. I'm on page 221, and I'm going to quote what he says on what I think is the question you're asking. He says, as for nature herself, she speaks through the newly born, undefiled, and uncontaminated. Her word is true philosophy, the vera ratio, so often invoked by Lucretius. And then in the next paragraph, DeWitt says this, out of this teaching arises a perplexing question. Was Epicurus, in making of nature a judge and incidentally a teacher, involuntarily ascribing to her a certain purposiveness, and by so doing admitting himself as a believer in teleology? Let me stop there, Cassius. Is that kind of the question you're asking?
It is. The purpose word is key to the discussion. Did nature have a purpose? And I think you're going to answer that nature itself has no purpose. I believe I remember the rest of the quote being something to the effect that an unpurposive nature evolved over time a purposive creature in man. That's a large part of the question, but the question also involves the propriety of looking at what is and deriving from what is the question of what ought to be.
Okay, so you're making the point of David Hume. Whether looking to what is a mere description of how things are can ever give you insight into how they should be. That's an excellent question. I'm not sure that Epicurus is falling into that trap, but it's certainly something we need to think about. Let me put it in these terms, because one of the things we've discussed, and if you go back to our interview with Emily Austin, she says it repeatedly, I think, and I found it to be interesting. And I'm still not sure how to wrap my head around the distinction, but basically the distinction is this. She described Epicurus as a psychological hedonist. And actually, we see that if you go back to book 1 in this very text, we see Torquatus making the same point that, well, Cicero, you say that my ancestor did such and such, took the necklace off the enemy because it signified virtue or to keep the troops in order or to save Rome from some calamity. But Torquatus is saying my ancestors did all of these things ultimately for the pursuit of pleasure. And this is kind of the claim of psychological hedonism, that everything we do, if you could see it clearly, is geared toward either the pursuit of pleasure or the avoidance of pain.
Yes, I think this is a key issue. Remember last week, we were quoting Cicero as saying that whether pleasure is a primary endowment of nature is a very difficult problem. And he's considering pleasure to be corruption, as opposed to something that nature has given us that is natural and should be accepted. So you've got this issue of how to view pleasure. I think we all agree there's no way to interpret Epicurus as anything but saying that there's no supernatural force that had a purpose or a design that created things the way they are, and we should follow the design because we want to honor that creator or that designer. That's one method of analysis that religion adopts and says it's just obvious. This could not have arisen on its own. There must have been a designer behind it. We therefore should follow the designer because that just makes sense to follow the designer. And the point I'm just trying to hammer home is that I can see somebody saying Epicurus is doing the same thing. You raise the term psychological hedonism. He's saying that this is the way people are. They are created by nature, and they are following pleasure, pursuing pleasure, and avoiding pain. And therefore, it's just a function of nature that they're doing that. I guess that's the question is, should we accept, and I realize that this relates to this is ought question and so forth. And I know that we're not going to be able to go too far into that today. But just in terms of looking at what Epicurus is doing versus what Aristotle is doing, Aristotle is looking at human beings and saying that it is thought and action that is the primary natural endowment of man. And so therefore, since that's the primary natural endowment, that's what we're going to follow. And I think Epicurus is to a significant degree looking at humans and seeing that we pursue pleasure and avoid pain, and that is at least one of the primary natural endowments, if not the primary natural endowment, and that because it is a primary natural endowment, yes, we should follow that. So I guess I'm seeing a little bit of a commonality. And of course, the Stoics are saying, we follow nature, we follow nature, we follow nature. Well, as again, the Witt points this out, that the Stoics made a fetish to some extent of saying we're following nature. But to a large extent, you could say the same thing about Epicurus, if not stronger, that Epicurus is looking at the reality of what we are and our pleasure and pain mechanism and saying, I'm going to follow what nature told me to do. I'm going to follow pleasure and avoid pain. So it's what you choose to see as a primary natural endowment, it seems to me, is so critically important here. And Cicero is simply choosing to label pleasure and to some extent pain, the whole passion issue, the whole issue of feeling. He's seeing the feelings as obstacles to rational thought and action in the best way of human life. Whereas Epicurus, as Diogenes Laertius tells us, says that the wise man is going to feel more deeply than other people, and that this will not be an obstacle to his reason. So we keep circling around this issue of pleasure and its place in this analysis, and whether it sits in the center, whether it sits along with virtue or something else, or whether it's ejected entirely from the throne of the judgment seat, so to speak.
Right. Let's recap those two positions briefly. So the point that Aristotle is saying that basically we were created with reason in view from the very beginning is very different from what Epicurus is saying, which is what Lucretius is saying in that passage, that we're not created with anything in view, that we developed out of natural processes that left us standing here with no view that we can find of any design that produced us, but nevertheless we are here. So that difference to me is quite stark. But the second point you made regarding what is known as Hume's guillotine, this is ought problem in philosophy, I always feel slightly shut down anytime this comes up, because I do think that in many ways this is insuperable. We can't really argue against this claim. I haven't read any good response to Hume on this point. But the problem is, if it's fatal to any one philosophy, it's fatal to all of them, isn't it? We would be left with the conclusion that you can't make any claim about morality or teleology or what is the good or what is the end. And so it's very paralyzing in that way. Let me read that quote from DeWitt. This is not directly the question you're asking, but he says, thus, so far as touches teleology, the net situation may be described as follows. There is no purposiveness in nature, but in the processes of non-purposive creation, she has brought into being a purposive creature, man. For him, being capable of reason, a telos is conceivable. And then you're saying that, well, to say that man is purposive, to say that reason has endowed him with the ability to conceive a telos, that is a violation of the is-ought problem as clearly as anything is. And I'm not even entirely sure you're wrong about that, if that's what you're saying.
Joshua, I think I agree with what you said earlier, that the whole question of this is-ought problem is such a very difficult one to understand. I don't even know that I understand that there is an is-ought problem. I think that Epicurus is looking at nature and saying, this is what is, and I'm going with nature. And if that's a violation of Hume's is-ought rule, then to heck with Hume. Because it seems to me, ultimately, that is your only basis for decision-making. If you don't look at nature and follow nature, then you are simply imagining things that don't exist because we consider nature to be all that exists. So that would be my problem with invoking Hume. I'm not sure that I even understand what Hume's problem is. I don't see that I have an alternative to following nature. Do you understand Hume to be suggesting some alternative to following nature?
No, Hume, I think, is saying that we can't bridge that gap at all. You couldn't point to God. You couldn't point to morality. You couldn't point to nature. You couldn't point to law. You couldn't point to anything to bridge that gap. But it's been clear to me for a long time that the Epicureans kind of sensed this problem, in part because Epicurus says when he looks to the young of all species, when he looks to newborn children, that the claim that while they pursue pleasure and avoid pain is not something that has to be supported by elaborate argument. He seems to understand that once you invoke argument into this problem, that you are caught on the horns of the Aesop problem. Epicurus is kind of saying that he points to the animals, to the young of all species, and to newborn children, and it's not argument, it's not elaborate argument that bridges that gap for him.
I very much agree with what you said earlier, Joshua, that it seems like Epicurus was anticipating this problem, because I think that gives you the answer as to Epicurus's position when he says that it is not necessary or appropriate to try to create a long logical argument for certain things that are obvious. You simply indicate toward them, you simply point to them, and you accept them for what they are. It seems to me there's a lot of depth there that tells you that Epicurus is looking at the way things are and concluding that at least certain aspects of it are the way things ought to be. Snow is white, honey is sweet is the way nature has provided.
Yeah. Now, one thing about Hume's guillotine is that he does allow for what we call instrumental oughts. So an instrumental ought is a sort of sentence structure where you say, if you want X, then you should do Y, then you ought to do Y. If you want to quench your thirst, then you ought to get a drink. So it's not that any ought is impossible, it's that these transcendental moral oughts is what they're sometimes referred to as, that those are impossible.
Yeah, I can see a big difference between just looking at pleasure and pain and saying that animals are created by nature to pursue pleasure and avoid pain. That's one thing. But then when you start trying to get very specific about something that an animal should do or should not do, that becomes much more complicated. You can observe pleasure and pain through feeling, but that's the trick. How do you actually act in order to produce pleasure and avoid pain? That's the issue that is so difficult. But at the same time, both things are true. It is difficult to determine exactly how to go about pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain. But the feelings that are there implanted by nature are the starting point and the end point of the blessed life, as Epicurus says. That just is the way it is. How you apply your life, how you get to that point, is a much more complicated question. Let's begin to wrap up today with final thoughts on Cicero's contention that reason gives no indication that man came into existence for the sole purpose of enjoying pleasures. Of course, understanding Cicero there to mean when he says the sole purpose of enjoying pleasure, Cicero is alleging that Epicurus is saying that we come into existence for the sole purpose of these sweet stimulations of the spirit and the body that all men consider to be pleasure. He's not giving Epicurus credit for these other types of pleasures that Epicurus also holds.
So Cicero is saying that virtue is the highest and best thing, but he's not able to see that virtue is done for the sake of pleasure. In other words, he's almost blind to pleasure. Whereas Epicurus would say that you would choose virtue if it led to pleasure and well-being.
Cicero is saying that the kind of pleasure that he associates with the word pleasure is corrupt, is disreputable, and has no connection with virtue of any kind. So Cicero is not ever going to allow the possibility that you would pursue virtue for the sake of pleasure. Cicero is saying that you're pursuing virtue for the sake of virtue, or maybe he's got some other argument, but he is never going to allow a seat at the table for pleasure. Also, as we begin to close, I'm reminded of what we discussed last week, that at one point Cicero seemed to be saying, Epicurus, you're wrong to look to nature for the supreme good. At other times, Cicero seems to be saying, Epicurus, you're looking at nature wrong. If you look at nature, you'll see that the supreme good is something different than what you see. Which position is Cicero ultimately taking? That it is correct to look to nature, or is it wrong to look to nature in the first place? The bottom line is Epicurus wrong to look at nature, or is he looking at nature wrong?
Well, looking at nature, that's a very broad category. It includes everything we've been talking about, right? Everything from Epicurus looking to the young of all species, modern day Christians looking to nature as a kind of revelation of God that can tell us truths about morality. Cicero and Aristotle looking to these primary natural endowments. I think Cicero would probably say you look to nature, but you don't look to animals because animals, as he said, are corrupt or corruptible. You look to nature for the fingerprints of God, for the fingerprints of the design, of the why we are here. And for me, there is no why we are here. We're just here. This issue of morality continues to bother me, that nothing could be true unless it is moral or virtuous, that nothing can be the good unless it is moral or virtuous, that nothing can be the telos or the guide or the purpose unless it is moral and virtuous. And I just find that kind of thing absurd. It's ridiculous to say that this is the criterion of what is true, that it has to be moral or that it has to be virtuous. I see where the argument comes from, right? If you take the view that nature is the product of a benevolent creator, then morality, virtue, these are things which he has created in nature that are inherent to nature. I quoted Charles Darwin, who I agree with extensively on this point. I just don't think that's true. One area that I see this kind of thing come up is this issue of rights. Do rights exist in nature? Do our rights come from God? Do rights come from the government? Or do we make them up? And when you look back at the history of the American Revolution, since I've been quoting Thomas Jefferson today, I can quote this. This is John Adams' notes of debates in the Continental Congress, September 8th, which was a Thursday. And there's this argument here in which a Mr. Galloway says, I never could find the rights of Americans in the distinctions between taxation and legislation, nor in the distinction between laws for revenue and for the regulation of trade. I have looked for our rights in the laws of nature, but could not find them in a state of nature, but always in a state of political society. I have looked for them in the Constitution of the English government, and I have found them there. Just because you want this stuff to exist in nature, just because you want nature to be moral or just or virtuous, it does not follow that it actually is those things. Cicero started this whole thing. He says here at the bottom of page 46, at the very beginning of section 13, the section we've been talking about, he says, reason has decided that pleasure cannot sit on the throne with any semblance of morality. It has to be virtue. It has to be reason and virtue. And then Cicero says, attaching myself to her unbiased opinion, I shall now take the same course. I shall narrow the field of the dispute, and I shall assume that all the uncomplex schemes of the philosophers in which virtue is not added are to be entirely banished from philosophy. Well, I'm sorry, Cicero, but just because you want that to be true doesn't mean that it is. I don't know why I find this so infuriating, but it absolutely gets me worked up because it starts from assumptions that are so perilously wrong, and it deserves to be called out wherever it crops up. And it crops up in Cicero so frequently, and it's frustrating to me.
Yes, it is. Joshua, let's go back to the original question that we started with that Cicero raised near the beginning of section 12. I think we can summarize the question we've been discussing today this way. What is the court of ultimate jurisdiction that has the ability, the jurisdiction, to tell us what the supreme good is? What would Epicurus's answer to that question be? To what tribunal, to what court, to what judge do we look to decide what is the supreme good?
That's an interesting question. My immediate answer is to say to the canon, right? To the canon of truth, to the sensations, to the feelings, and to the prolepsis. Vera ratio, the true reason of Epicurean philosophy.
And where does nature fit in that question? Is nature a tribunal? Is nature a judge?
Well, again, this is DeWitt's problem. He says that Epicurus is involved in paradox here because he seems to be setting nature up as a judge in her own right.
I don't know that I think it's a paradox or a problem. I think DeWitt's correct. I think that that's what Epicurus is doing. He is saying, look to nature and you will see, without any need for logical proof and exposition, that pleasure is desirable and pain is undesirable, and that nature gives us nothing other than pleasure and pain by which to answer that question. Jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is an interesting word. It's not a particular judge. As you were citing from George Galloway earlier, it's a question of where do you find the right to make this decision? Nature as we observe it, or a divine force that we understand through logic?
I found this quote again from DeWitt. He says, "Was Epicurus, in making of nature a judge and incidentally a teacher, involuntarily ascribing to her a certain purposiveness, and by doing so, admitting himself to be a believer in teleology?" That's not exactly what you were asking there, but DeWitt does seem to be saying that Epicurus makes of nature a judge.
Yes, and a teacher, yes. Not that we need to parse DeWitt so closely, but I would think that's exactly what that sentence means. In making nature a judge and a teacher, that he's saying Epicurus does that. And I think he's right. I think Epicurus is making nature the judge and the teacher, and saying that that's where you find the jurisdiction for deciding how to live. And it's not in religion or in ideal forms or in some kind of essences that you make contact with through logic. It is, again, as we started off the episode today, Cicero says, well, what do the senses have jurisdiction over? They decide whether it's sweet and bitter, smooth and rough, near or distant, at rest or in motion, whether it's rectangular or circular. That's what the senses tell us. But it's reason that has knowledge of things human and divine with virtue that we should look to make these decisions.
We should clarify, though, when you say that nature is a judge, we don't mean that nature has that ability to do things. I've told the story before about the official measuring sticks of the British Empire were housed in this building that burned down. And so when they rebuilt it, they put them up as plaques, bronze plaques in different parts of the city, so that anyone could go up to this plaque and say, okay, this is a centimeter, right? And if I hold this thing up to it, I will know for certain whether this thing that I'm holding is a centimeter or not, because I have the test of that right here on this wall in Trafalgar Square. And to me, that, I guess, is what we mean when we say that nature is a judge. We hold things up to her to determine whether they bear that true stamp or not.
Right.
Is that a better way of putting it?
Nature certainly does not have an intelligent design, goal, purpose for our lives. On the other hand, we do see the Epicureans allegorically personifying nature. In Lucretius, the end of the long discussion of death, where Lucretius personifies nature as if she is lecturing the man who is facing death and how inappropriate his feelings are in response to death. The opening of Book 1 with Venus guiding all living things to propagate their species and so forth. It's definitely within the Epicurean viewpoint to allegorically personify nature as if she is leading us. But again, I think you're right, Joshua, to say that there's a line that you do not cross. You do not think that nature is an intelligent being which created you for a particular purpose, and your goal should be to study these holy books or other methods of divine inspiration to find out what God wants you to do every moment of your life. That's far beyond anything Epicurus would countenance. But at the same time, as is so often the case, there are these subtle differences in the way Epicurus looks at things, that even though nature did not do these things intelligently and did not do them with design, we still look to what nature has done and what nature has provided for our guidance.
Yeah, DeWitt here says on page 222, when such phrases are employed as the justice of nature or the limits of nature, this means only that the intelligent agent, the human, looks to the phenomena of nature in order to observe there the signs by which he shall know the true nature of justice and the true limits of pleasure. In the same way, he looks to the behavior of the newly born for the signs that shall inform him of the identity of the telos of living. It's not that nature is a personified judge sitting in an actual chair telling you what's true or not. She is the standard, the gold standard. And if you want to know if you have grasped some semblance of what is true, you hold it up to nature and make your comparison in that way.
Okay, well, let's come to the end of our episode today on the jurisdiction to determine what the supreme good is. And let's go around and see if anybody has additional thoughts. Martin?
Yes, I would like to comment on this Hume's is-ought thing. So he is right in the sense that we cannot have a logical reasoning where we come from an is to what we should do. We need to add something. And the one thing we add here is the choice. So it's our choice that we see that nature gives us pleasure and pain as our guides on how to take action. So we positively make this choice. Okay, then we take this serious and use our reason to make this as an efficient choice as possible. And other people, for example, those who then disagree that we were not created without a purpose and just happened as a part of evolution, so that those people who will then think that mankind was created by a god who wants mankind to be virtuous in some sense, then those people will have a different choice.
Yes, Martin, thank you for adding that in. I think that's a good explanation of the issue. Okay, Calasini.
This was in response to Joshua, what he said earlier. I could sense a bit of passion in his voice. And then also at that very moment, I was thinking, why is it that Cicero is just so obsessed with virtue? It's as if Cicero does not trust human beings to be able to develop wisdom. It's like he doesn't seem to acknowledge that with regard to pleasure and pain, that we can learn, that we can gain knowledge, that we can use our memory, and that we can anticipate future outcomes. Because when we do all that, we're not just some kind of corrupt animal doing the first impulse that comes to mind. We're using reason, we're using thought and intelligence to live the best life possible.
Yes, great point, Calasini. You know, when you started off by focusing on why Cicero is obsessed, I think your statements are exactly correct. It's sobering to realize that I don't think it is just Cicero, though. As we've gone through book 2 and we've discussed our episodes on the forum, we're joking about how we dislike Cicero. The sobering thing is that Cicero's views that he's relaying here are not those only of himself. Cicero's presenting to us the distilled summary of these other anti-Epicurean philosophical schools that were in existence not only in his time, but have continued to be the prevailing orthodoxy for the last 2,000 years. So it would be nice to think that Cicero himself were uniquely wrong about the way he's presenting these things. Unfortunately, Cicero is speaking for the great majority of Western orthodoxy in the way he's presenting these opinions. Okay, Joshua?
Well, I'm glad you said that, Cassius, because that set me up for what I was going to say, which is this quote from Hamlet by William Shakespeare. This is Act 2, Scene 2. This is one of the most famous quotes in all of Shakespeare. He says, "What a piece of work is a man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And yet to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Man delights not me." So you're right to say that the ideas that Cicero is channeling have become established orthodoxy in a way. And we see it everywhere. We see it here in Hamlet. We see it in our laws, in our governments that we set up for ourselves, that people want to believe that morality is intrinsic in the nature of things, that it has been put there by a designer, and that the only way to know what we should do is by looking back to what that designer has to say directly to us. It's so foreign. It's so foreign to the way the Epicureans thought. And to me, that's part of the draw of Epicurean philosophy, that there was this sophisticated system, extant and well-developed in the ancient world that could answer so many of the questions that this other way of looking at things leaves unanswered.
Yeah, people know, whether it's instinctively or whatever word you want to use, they know that pleasure and pain are of central importance in life. And no matter how Cicero or these other philosophers work up their logic to try to exclude pleasure and pain from the determination of what is the supreme good, people know that doesn't make sense. They know there's something wrong with it. And that's where Epicurus was giving the key to understanding how to place these things in their proper perspectives, how to see that the primary natural endowments of man do include pleasure and pain. And he extended the definition of pleasure so that it included these other aspects of healthy, normal, mental, and physical living, and created from all this a coherent philosophy that Cicero thought needed to be banished. Luckily, he was not successful, at least in banishing it permanently. And we will come back next week to continue on in section 13 and go further into Cicero's arguments. Thanks for your time today. Please be sure to drop by the forum and participate in our discussion about this episode or other aspects of Epicurean philosophy. Again, thanks for your time today. We'll be back next week.